Well, well, well. Look what the cat dragged in.
Guys, whatever this is, take it outside.
Why? Why? You don't call. You don't write. How else am I supposed to get your attention?
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and today I have got a new guest who I'm very excited to talk about, even though the movie itself is one I'm not so much of a fan of. The movie is X-Men Origins Wolverine, and the guest is Carrie Harris. Carrie, how you doing today?
Doing all right. How are you?
I'm doing good. Like I said before, I'm not so excited about the movie, but I am excited to have the discussion. I think there's a lot to talk about here. So sometimes the bad movies make for the best discussions.
I absolutely agree.
Awesome. So before we get started, though, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
I am a full-time writer. I write novels, comics, video games, RPGs, you name it, I do it. I do a lot of licensed stuff. So I've done a few novels for Marvel, which is probably why I'm here. My most recent book is for Arkham Horror, the board game. And I've done a bunch of other things too. I've been a lifelong Marvel fan, although you can't see me. And actually, I wore long sleeves, but I have an X-Men tattoo, which I got after my first book came out. Was like, I've made it. So I'm pretty geeked out to be here.
Very cool. I'm very excited to talk to you about all that kind of stuff. First, though, I got to ask, what is the X-Men tattoo of? Who do you got tattooed on you?
I actually just have this symbol. Yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Some people, I've seen some tattoos on Reddit and stuff, and people go like all out with like different character tattoos.
Yeah, well, my original thought was I would do like in a row down my arm, I'd do the X-Men tattoo, and then I wrote Avengers, so I do the Avengers symbol, and then I wrote Ghost Rider, so I do the flaming skull, and I just haven't gotten the other two yet.
That's cool.
But then what happens if I do more?
Yeah.
I'll be out of arm.
Well, hopefully we'll get some transplants up going soon.
I like how you
but
think.
yeah. So I'm an author myself. I'm a published author. Not full time, unfortunately, not at that point yet. But I've got to say, I have written my fair share of Marvel stuff. Except my stuff has all been fan fiction. So I am very envious, and I just got to ask, as a fan who would love to do that kind of stuff, how did you get into that?
Okay, so you said the magic words to me anyway, which is fan fiction. I actually wrote X-Men fanfic when I was in junior high. That was the first superheroes material that I wrote. I wrote blatant self-insert in which Kitty Pryde was my neighbor. It's called the Kitty and Carrie Chronicles, and we went on adventures together, most of which had to do with the boys that I had a crush on, or people who were mean to me or anything like that. So I wrote fanfic for a long time. I figured that writing would just be a hobby, and then I knew someone who wrote for RPGs when I was in college. So I did that for a little bit. That was my first professional credit, and then I went out and got a real job. That's what you're supposed to do, and so I did. And it wasn't until after my kids were born and daycare was too expensive that my husband and I decided I was going to stay home and I was going to write that book that I'd always been talking about. And if I sold one before they were all in full-time school, then I would keep writing. And if not, I would go back to work. And my youngest are 18, and I've never gone back to work.
Wow, that's a great story. It's glad that it worked out for you. Like sometimes I've known a lot of people in the publishing world, and it's really hit or miss with whether or not you can graduate to that full-time status. I've known people who got a hit right off the gate and they quit their jobs, and like a few years later they ended up having to go back to work. I've known people who grinded away for a few years and then were able to go full time and haven't gone back. And I know people like me who've just been grinding away and haven't made the full time break yet. So it's
Yeah.
all sorts, it's all types, and it seems like it's there's never a guaranteed path with these things. But it's awesome that that worked for you, though.
Right, right. Well, and it's part skill and part just blind luck. But the one piece of advice, if you've got people who are listening who are wanting to do this, is the real key for me was diversifying. I do enough different things that if one thing is not selling well, I have other things still in the fire, and that's a big part of what's kept me afloat.
Yeah, that's a very good advice too. So now you did mention, of course, obviously you've been a lifelong Marvel fan. So let's talk a little bit about how you got interested in Marvel and superheroes in the first place.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was really two characters. I brought up Kitty Pryde, and for me, it was the whole fact that she was just a regular suburban teenage girl. And especially female characters back in the 80s, they were all princesses and queens and goddesses. And there weren't that many of them either, at least not in the headlining, in the headlining teams. And so to see somebody who looked like me and who could have been my friend was a huge, oh my God, I can be a superhero moment. And so it was that, and also Ghost Rider. I come from a family of bikers. My On both sides of my family, I have motorcycle mechanics. That's what they did for a living. They all rode bikes. My uncle was one of those guys who rode a bike in parades, and so it was like a huge thing. And so I saw Ghost Rider with the flaming motorcycle on the cover, had no idea what it was, but thought that my dad would think it was cool. And so those were my first two superheroes. And then I just never stopped.
Awesome. So I got to ask, when you think of Ghost Rider, are you more John Blaze or more Dan Ketch?
Johnny Blaze was my first Ghost Rider, and actually I did write a Ghost Rider book, and it's Johnny.
Really awesome. That's so cool. Yeah, I came in with Danny when I first started getting into Ghost Rider, but later on, and I mentioned the story before on the show, but a buddy of mine, Chris Munn, I'm not sure if he still does, but he used to run like one of the biggest Ghost Rider fan site on the web, like Vengeance Unleashed,
Uh-huh.
and he got me into Johnny Blaze. So I went back and he suggested like which parts of the original run to read, which parts to skip, and I went back and I really started getting into Johnny, and then Jason Aaron's run came out, and that just made me a total fan of Johnny from that. So I think
Right.
now I lean a little bit more towards Johnny.
I think they're both spectacular
They
characters,
are.
and it's not one of those things where, when you think of Ghost Rider, it's like, oh, clearly there is a better choice, and the other one just didn't work. They both do for different reasons.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think it's kind of like Doctor Who, where the first one that hits you is the one that sticks with you. At
yeah.
least
I
for
think so.
me.
I think that's the case. Yeah, it's the same thing with like James Bond. A lot of people have the same kind of feeling. The one they first got exposed to is the one that they gravitate to. So even though
Yeah.
um Timothy Dalton was in the movies when I was going, and actually no, Brosnan was my first Bond that I watched in the theater, but I grew up on the Sean Connery movies because my dad loved those.
Yeah.
So I always gravitated more towards him as a result.
See, I'm old, so my first James Bond was Roger Moore, and no,
Yeah.
no.
Okay, yeah,
Just kind of a low
that's an
point.
except that's
So,
always the exception to the rule.
right.
Okay. Now what I like to ask guests too is what kind of stuff are they interested in lately? So what have you been watching or listening to or reading that's been really kind of grabbing your attention these days?
Well, because I've just finished writing two books in 2 months, which I do not advise. Don't do that. It's a bad idea. I haven't read or watched very much, I'm going to confess. But I did just get a promo pack of books, the Dungeon Crawler Carl books. I don't know if you've heard of these.
Oh, I'm actually halfway through the first book and it's really good.
Yeah, I'm halfway through the second. I got them right before the Thanksgiving break, and I read a book and a half over the past weekend. They're so funny. So definitely, and they scratch my nerd itch, like definitely lit RPG feels like I'm playing a video game, but without the 200 hours it takes to actually play a video game. So, yeah, I've really really liked that. But I have a whole stack of comics. Well, you can't see me anyway, but I have a whole stack of comics off to the side here that I have to read, um, because badly. I don't think I've read anything in 2 months.
Oh yeah, I know what that's like. I've got my kids are toddlers, so the only time I can manage to get some free time is after they go to sleep. So it's like from like 9 to 12, I've got 3 hours where I can either watch a movie or read stuff or try and see if I can push the time a little bit to squeeze in both. And I'm not physical anymore because I live in Japan, but my Kindle is just stuffed with books that I bought that I haven't gotten to yet. It's like it's in triple digits. I know. And then I got the Marvel Unlimited subscription too, which also makes it harder to complete that reading list.
Yep, I hear you. I have the same problem. And I actually, like at the end of every year, I try to make like a bit of a chunk of time where I'm not drafting anything, and it's cram things into my brain hole as quickly as I can and try to get all caught up and refill the well and all that stuff. So I'm heading into that now, and let me tell you, I'm thrilled.
Awesome.
So,
Yeah, that's really cool.
unfortunately, I'd probably have more to say if we talked about this in a week, but literally read one book.
That's all right. That's fine. I mean, Dungeon Crawler Carl is a good pick anyway. So,
Yes.
I have for my part, I've also been struggling to kind of keep up with stuff. But one thing I saw, and it's completely unrelated to this show or the topic or anything, but I watched the new John Benet Ramsey documentary on Netflix, and
Oh yeah.
yeah, and it didn't really have a whole lot of new information. I mean, there's some stuff in there I didn't know, but it really just kind of like drove home just how completely fucked up the media ecosystem is in America.
Yeah, seriously. Well, and it's the kind of thing where if you were around then you just remember, like I remember all that. I remember a lot of the girls who were kidnapped. There were three of them that were kidnapped in Cleveland, and I'm from Cleveland. And so that was a big story when they found them. And I just remember seeing all the posters up everywhere, and it's surreal, the sort of world that we live in, and then to see that kind of thing reflected in fiction, uh,
Hmm.
is huge to me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But anyway, today we are talking about, as I mentioned before, we're talking about X-Men Origins Wolverine, the 2009 film directed by Gavin Hood, which was supposed to be the first of a series of X-Men Origins spin-offs. So there was going to be this one, then it was going to be followed up with X-Men Origins Magneto. But then this one did not do well at the box office. It, got critically, massacred. And so as a result of that, they kind of retooled stuff and they folded up the script that they had for X-Men Origins Magneto. They folded that up into First Class, which actually ended up being the best parts of First Class in my opinion. So I kind of wish we did get to see Magneto Nazi Hunter instead.
Yeah.
But they also had, I think they also talked about doing like an X-Men Origins Cyclops. I think they talked about a Storm movie as well. We also got we also got a first introduction of Ryan Reynolds as Wade Wilson in this, which was we'll talk about that.
Yep.
We also finally got Gambit in this movie after teasing it. He was supposed to be in there was an edited scene, which I don't think has ever actually been publicly released, with like a stuntman who had played him in like one brief scene. I don't know if that's ever been released anywhere, but that was a deleted scene. And then he was originally in some of the drafts of the script for The Last Stand, but they didn't have time for him and they cut him out completely. Um, and up until Deadpool and Wolverine, this is the only time we actually saw Gambit in live action. So, and also this had an interesting thing because the test screener of it, or like it was before all the effects were finished, it ended up being leaked online. And I was one of the people who actually saw that original version with the unfinished CGI, and um And just watching that version, I'm just like, I know it's unfinished, and I'm hoping it's going to be better once the finished cut is done. And then when I did see the finished cut, my whole reaction was just like, I want to like this so bad, but there's just so much stuff in it that just makes it really hard. Um, so let's throw the ball over to you. What was your memory going into this movie?
I remember all of that you talked about. I always thought, now I can't really remember what order this happened in because, what is time and why is it mean to me? But I can't remember whether Magneto Testament came out before or after this movie. What um, it looks like
That's
you're
a good
checking.
question. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm going to check that out right now. So,
because I either want to say that I thought at the time that the whole idea of Magneto Origins would have been great because you could put some of Testament on the screen. Or in retrospect, when Testament came out, I thought whatever order of operations makes sense is the order in which it happened.
yeah,
But
it looks like it started coming out in 2008 and then it finished in 2009. So, so that was around the time when this movie was released. So I think Testament
yeah,
could very well have been, a big part of their thinking when they were working on the script.
which is brilliant thinking because that's one of the best comics I've ever read. And like if you're going to put some of Magneto's origin story on film, man, put Testament up there and let me cry.
Yeah, I when going into test when I first heard about Testament, I'm like, do we really need this? I mean, how many different times have we gotten Magneto's origin story? And then I read it, and I'm just like, okay, yeah, we needed this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and the thing is that his origin story is kind of piddled out a little bit here and there, whereas this one really made you sit with it in a it, and it kind of coalesced it all into a story with a beginning and middle and an end, and that made a difference. Like my whole view of Magneto changed after that one, which is
Yeah.
not this movie, but it kind of like thinking about what this series could have been. It's a pity.
Well, I mean, even just looking at what, and I have problems with the second half of First Class, but I think the first half is really solid, and even just like how well that executed it. Like, there's still like I'm looking at this and there is a good movie buried somewhere in here. And I know there have been a bunch of different fan edits of this that are floating around out there. I've never seen any of them, but every time I watch this movie, I'm just in my mind mentally editing different scenes together in different orders to figure out like how could you make this at least a little bit more serviceable, a little bit more faithful to the character and the world, because I feel like what happened with this movie, and I feel like this is the same thing that happened with First Class, is that you have so many different people involved with it, and nobody really knows what they want out of this. I get the feeling that, there were some people who really did want a Wolverine origin story where they focus on the Weapon X stuff and his relationship with Sabretooth. But then there are other people, probably the producers, the studio heads, who are like, oh, no, no, it's an X-Men movie. We have to throw as many mutants in there as possible. We've got all the rights to all these mutants, so we have to throw as many in as possible. So that's why you get really weird shit like Cyclops popping out of nowhere. You get Emma Frost and Silver Fox are sisters for some reason,
Yeah.
and you have this the Team X squad gets expanded from like what it was like 4 or 5 in the comics to like 10. And it's just
Yep.
none of this is necessary.
Well, and for me, like I do the same thing. When you watch something and you're really excited about it, you're excited about what it could have been, like trying to essentially rewrite it. Like, what would I have done? And for me, the real issue is the fact that Stryker's plan makes zero sense.
Not a
He
lick.
has no plan. His plan keeps changing. And so as an adversary, he doesn't work. And Stryker in the comics is pretty chilling. Like he's not a fly by the seat of your pants sort of guy. And the fact that he kind of is in this movie, I think is a big part of what makes it fall apart because he's supposedly been directing all of this from behind the scenes the whole time. But why? What I mean, we know what he says he's trying to do, but it doesn't make any sense that he's going about it this way.
Yeah, I don't understand any of it because especially because you're picking up with Stryker with the basis that you'd established from Brian Cox in X2. And in that movie, it established very clear motivations for his character. The reason why he hates mutants is his son was a mutant. He brought him to Professor X to fix. Xavier said, "That's not what I do. I can't fix him." And then when his son came back, he felt so, discarded by his father that he tormented his parents with illusions to the point where, Stryker's wife killed herself. And that's a reason why he hates Xavier and all the mutants. That totally tracks. And in this, then we get all this stuff about he's trying to make the ultimate weapon or something like that. And even still at the end, when we get to, I mean, he gets arrested at the end of the movie. So I'm just like, well, how does he end up rising through the ranks to become a colonel in X2 then? None of this works at all. None of this tracks.
Yeah. Well, and then stuff like just poor decision making in general. Like, if you're gonna make somebody indestructible, and your plan is let's do that first, and then let's take his DNA and wipe his memory. Couldn't you switch the order there?
I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, it's not gonna take a whole lot of time to put his DNA on file, and then you do the procedure. If he dies, okay, fine. His DNA is worthless, and then you just destroy the DNA. But if he lives, then you're like, okay, now we know. And then if he escapes, well, at least we still have his DNA. No, exactly. I was thinking the exact same thing.
Yeah. Well, or wipe his memory first and then convince him that you are his only friend. It sounds like I should be a supervillain at this point, but I mean, like you convince him that you're his only friend and he wants to do this and et cetera, and then your project has a much greater chance of producing a weapon X that you can use.
Well, here's one of the things too I was thinking of is that this really should have been a mystery, something like Memento or something like that, where he wakes up, in the woods or something with no memory of who he is, where he came from, how he has these, and then he goes back through and he's trying to piece his memories together. That would have made for something a lot more satisfying, a lot more interesting. I mean, we as fans, we already know all the beats of this story, but for, the casual viewers, this is all going to be totally new to them because the way it goes, the way that they want this story to play out, you can't tell that story with his memory being wiped. So he has to have his memory intact when he gets the adamantium. And then when we're going through the movie and we get to the end, it's like, oh shit, we forgot he's supposed to have his memory wiped. Oh, adamantium bullet, problem solved. Which again, someone's got to explain the physics of that to me because I don't understand how an adamantium bullet impacting on an adamantium skull will do anything other than flatten.
Yeah. Well, and logically it doesn't make sense. I suppose it does have the like there's the emotion of seeing him at the end not knowing everything that you know. And so if the movie was good, it's a great place to end. But
I think that's that kind of sums up the that's like the best thing you could say about this movie.
seriously. Well, and I mean there are some bright points like Hugh Jackman does his best and I did like to see, early Wolverine doesn't have the same physical presence or mannerisms that he has after he gets the adamantium claws and he gets really, really pissed off and starts Wolverining. I'm going to use it as a verb. Let's go with it. Um, so watching that physical transformation of him learning how to be Wolverine is kind of neat. And then there's Liev Schreiber, who does a great job, I think, as Sabretooth.
I think, yeah, he almost saves this movie. If there's any argument for why this movie can be saved, it's Liev Schreiber. Like and it's the only, and this is the only real criticism I have is just like my image of Sabretooth is he should be more physically imposing than Wolverine. And it's just like Hugh Jackman and Liev Schreiber, you put them next to each other, and you know they're at Hugh Jackman might be more physically imposing than Schreiber is. So there is that problem. So I wish they would have filmed it in such a way to. I mean, they make Tom Cruise look tall when they photograph him in these movies. So I think they could have done something like that with Liev Schreiber to make him look bigger and more imposing. And I also think it was a mistake with some of the way they show his fights, where he's like leaping around and being very cat-like. And I'm just like, I feel like this, like it's like every time he gets down on all fours and he starts leaping across, it's like, okay, come on, now we're getting kind of ridiculous here.
Yeah.
But and I would have liked to see like more physically imposing type of stuff. But aside from that, like his delivery, his he's very smooth, he's very cunning, he's very chilling. Like that scene when he confronts Bradley in the circus trailer, that is one of the most chilling scenes. Like when he takes the light bulb and his claws are just slowly growing, and he just says Bradley says, "I'm not afraid of dying," and then Victor just very coolly says, "How do you know? You've never tried it before."
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, he's got some great one-liners, and he definitely sells the Sabretooth. Sabretooth is one of my favorites. I actually put him in my first book completely as fan service to me, because I thought if they're only going to let me do one of these, I got to say I've written one of my favorites, so I put Sabretooth in there. And um, the Sabretooth that I wrote is actually during the period where he's trying to save Victor Creed. No, he said, sorry, Graydon Creed. He's trying to save his son. And so he's playing nice for Sabretooth, which is marginally acceptable to everyone else. But the thing that I love the most about Sabretooth is that he does not regret the things that he has done. You don't get the sense that this is a person who's tormented about his actions. And in this movie does capture that, I think.
No, yeah, I feel I love Sabretooth too. When I was writing X-Men fan fiction, I definitely tried to find ways to include Sabretooth as much as possible. He's a fun guy to write. He's a fun character to write just because, like you said, he has no compunctions about what he's done. He is so completely amoral, and he just loves to screw with people. And so it's a lot of fun to play with that.
Yeah, I agree. One of the most fun things I've ever done is writing Sabretooth trying to act like a regular person to not scare off children.
Yeah, that's I would love to take a look at that at some point. Yeah,
Well,
and
you know the author now, so
yes, I
why
do.
don't
I'm
you
gonna have to look
do
that up.
it?
But yeah, I thought he did such a great job in this, but I did think also they kind of undermined him at the end too, when he gets to this point and like his whole reason for working for Stryker all this time and doing all this is that he wants the adamantium skeleton himself. And like the whole reason for Logan getting the adamantium is so that he can be stronger than Sabretooth. And then we get to the end, and then Stryker's like, "Oh, your test came back. You would not survive the procedure." It's like, well, how? I mean, he's supposed to be the stronger one of the two to begin with. So that kind of undermines him. It's this whole idea of like Wolverine's been able to beat him this entire time anyway. So that really kind of bugged me. Um, and well, here's something else too. Like, what did you think of the whole idea of making them brothers? Because the whole Wolverine Sabretooth relationship has been done and redone in so many different ways. I can't remember. Can't remember if it was Claremont or if it was Hama who first established that Sabretooth was Wolverine's father. I think it might have been Claremont who did it at first. And then later on, that got retconned into them. That was just memory implants or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it was um Jeff Loeb did that weird thing where they were like part of some mutant wolf tribe or something. I don't know. It was really strange. I mean, my an interpretation I really liked was one I read in fanfic was when someone said that Sabretooth is actually Wolverine's son, and I thought that was an interesting twist on it. Um, but where do you stand on the whole Wolverine Sabretooth relationship? Like, what do you have a preference, or do you like it being vague?
I mean, I I think it makes sense that it's vague given how vague the rest of their background is. I think in this movie they did a pretty good job of setting up the it was a convenient shorthand for Wolverine going along with whatever Sabretooth says at first. It gives you a strong idea of the status quo so that when Wolverine finally says, "Nah, I'm not going to do that," and turns his back on him, we immediately understand that this is going to be a problem. So I think for this movie, it was a smart choice to start with. Um, I almost wanted to see a little bit more of it. Like, it was essentially, we are buddies, we are brothers, we are together, and now we're going to kill each other. And
Yeah.
the coin flipped very quickly, and then that was just it. Like, there was no story. I felt like there was more to be mined there. Does that make sense?
No, it does. And I felt the same thing. Like you see this opening. I mean, I'm not a big fan of Origin to begin with, and so seeing that part of it, I didn't really need that. But the opening credits when they're going through the wars and all that, I thought, okay, this is awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And then we see them like in Vietnam, and Victor's massacring the people with the machine gun, and we try and see Logan. He's trying to stop him. He's trying to hold it back, and then we go from that to them being with Team X, and then Logan just like you said, he flips on a dime and he's like, I'm not doing this anymore. It's like, dude, how much shit have you been involved in? I mean, like, we need some more motivation for you. Otherwise, and that makes for a more interesting character journey too, because one of the things that always intrigued me about this version of Wolverine in the films is when in X2, Stryker says to him, you were always an animal. I just gave you claws, right? That whole idea of like, he was a real bastard before. And so seeing that version of the character and seeing how he changes would have been a lot more interesting. But I guess the producers felt like, no, he's our hero, so he has to be good right from the start, which I think undermines the journey we're supposed to go on with him. And it undermines this whole twist in their relationship, because we need to have a reason why Logan now, after almost 200 years, feels like turning his back on his brother. And I don't think the movie gives us a good enough reason. And we could have done without a lot of the superfluous mutant cameo stuff and spent more time with that relationship and building that relationship up.
I agree. And I think, like you said, um, the moment when he shifts and says this is too much does not appear to be any different in terms of the level of cruelty than all the other things that happened before that. Maybe the only difference is that now Sabretooth has other people who are also as cruel as him. But that would mean, like, why would you join why would you join Stryker at all?
Yeah, and it also
The order
that
doesn't make sense.
and that part also doesn't track, because then after, when he gets the claw, when he gets the adamantium, then he goes back and he goes to Wraith, and they're old friends, and it's just like, well, so if you knew these guys were all bastards, then why would you go back to this guy who is a bastard? So that part of it also doesn't track too. So yeah, none of that part makes sense. I do want to talk more about this, but we're going to take a quick break and then we'll come right back. Since you're listening to this show, I already know you love watching superhero movies and TV shows, and you just might enjoy superhero comics. But how about superhero novels? I'm giving away 2 free superhero novels and 1 free superhero short story. Visit percivalconstantine.com/SCP to get access to Vanguard, Heroes Forged, the first novel in my own Avengers and X-Men inspired superhero novel series, and Ronin Born, my cyberpunk superhero novel set in a futuristic Japan. I'm also throwing in Fire and Lightning, a free prequel story to my new Power Rangers inspired superhero series, Omega Knights. So visit percivalconstantine.com/SCP, those are just the letters SCP, to get started, or click on the link in the show notes. And now, on with the show. We are back, still talking about X-Men Origins Wolverine. So one of the things, I want to talk a little bit about the Team X of it too, because I mean, I really think like the Team X stuff would have been the most interesting, especially if we pared down the team. You don't need Blob in there, even though I thought, what's his name, Kevin Durant. I thought he did a pretty decent job as the character, but you really don't need him in there. We don't need Bolt, played by Dominic Monaghan. I don't know why they use the Agent Zero instead of Maverick, but it because he also doesn't even have Maverick's powers, so I don't understand why they're using the Agent Zero version of it. That didn't make any sense to me at all. Um, and I really like seeing John Wraith in there. I do think John Wraith is a cool character in the comics, but the more I watch this movie, I'm just like, Will.i.am was not the best choice for this role. Just can't really. He feels like way too casual for this type of character, and just like I don't never really buy like. I mean, when he's fighting Sabretooth and he's like, "I'm gonna kill you now," I'm just like, the delivery is just so bad.
Yeah, and you also kind of don't believe like that version of Wraith stands no chance. Like that version of Wraith should run.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I think like I agree with you generally speaking. I do think Blob feels a little fan servicey. And
Hmm.
I don't mind fan service. Sometimes like heck, I've already just admitted most of the characters that I pick for my books are fan service to myself because I like them. Um, so I feel like Blob is one of those characters that people who only know a little bit about the X-Men can recognize. And so there is an advantage to that. We're going to pick a couple of people to use.
Yeah, I did think it was also kind of clever how they interpreted his powers, where it's not so much that he's a fat guy, it's just that he is like this invulnerable guy. So it's just like when he's fat, it just makes it's just invulnerable fat guy instead. So I thought that was a kind of interesting twist on him from what we usually see of him.
Yeah, and I do think that the fight with Wolverine's trying to take him down to get information, that was actually one of the better points in the show.
Hmm.
Um like it felt it was a full fight scene, which generally speaking, you've already referred to this. A lot of the fight scenes are watching people run at each other or run after other people. You don't actually
Yeah.
see a whole lot of fight choreography, and this one had some, and I liked that.
Yeah. I also really liked Ryan Reynolds as, pre Deadpool Wade Wilson. And I just feel so bad for what they did to him in this. I mean, he got his comeuppance eventually, but still, like I was so excited when I saw him in the first trailer, just like the clip of him. But when I'm watching the movie though, and I never really thought about this just because I'm so lost in the fact that it's Ryan Reynolds ad-libbing as Deadpool that got me so excited about this in the first place. Now that I've seen him in three movies, three and a half if you count Once Upon a Deadpool, um, going back and watching him in this, I found myself thinking, I'm like, what are his powers? Like, because it looks like he's spinning the swords at like superhuman speed. There's no mention of his healing factor or anything. I'm just like, how did this guy get on the team? Because in the movie, he was a regular guy. He was a hitman. He was really good at his job. He was special forces, but he didn't get superpowers until after he joined the program. So I did find myself wondering here. I'm like, why did Stryker pick this guy? Does he have some special powers that we don't know about here? Like this doesn't track.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting to watch this movie because it feels like Ryan Reynolds on a leash. Like he makes a couple of wisecracks. They're like, oh, you could tell he likes that one. He's happy with that one, but otherwise he just looks sad. He just looks sad. Like, oh, the things I could do with this if they only let me do it right.
Yeah, yeah. Which
Um,
fortunately he was finally able to. But yeah, I thought the elevator scene was where he was just completely riffing off the cuff, and I just felt like that was the scene when he was having the most fun.
yep.
Um, and you could and you know I don't know who leaked that footage on the net, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was Reynolds himself of the Deadpool test footage.
Mm.
Uh, but yeah, I felt so bad for him after this movie tanked, and then Fox was like, "I don't know, we don't know if we're gonna do Deadpool now." It's like, well, technically, you didn't do Deadpool in this movie, so why can you say that it was a bad the character itself doesn't work?
Right. Well, and is it me? person who thought giving us the merc with the mouth and then taking away his mouth is cruel.
It's unbelievably stupid. I mean, have you ever seen Kevin Smith talking about his experiences on writing Superman Lives?
Yeah.
So, for anyone who hasn't seen this, first off, go to YouTube and look up, Kevin Smith Superman Lives, and you'll see him talk about it in his stand up. Basically, a stand up. It was a convention appearance, but my late co-host Derek, he used to say it's like Richard Pryor level humor, and it
Mm-hmm.
really is, because one of the things he talks about is the three rules that producer John Peters gave him about writing Superman. He's like, Superman can't fly, he can't wear the costume, and he has to fight a giant robot spider in the third act. And like the first two, especially, like, he can't fly and he can't wear the costume. It's Superman. How are you going to have him not fly and not wear the costume? And that's like what they're doing with Deadpool here. It's like it's Deadpool, but he can't speak. That's the character's entire shtick. Without him, he's just a Deathstroke ripoff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and if they're going to turn somebody into Weapon X at the end, is there anybody in that movie who's a good choice?
I mean, well, here's actually where you could work in the Agent Zero idea. You have him Maverick in the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
and at the end you turn him into Agent Zero, but they wanted to work in the Weapon X, the Weapon Plus stuff from the Morrison run, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But that would have been one way to do it. I mean, you could have just had Sabretooth do it too. Like, he would have been, give him like the adamantium or something like that, have them go at it. But honestly, I don't even think you need that, like, Weapon 11 stuff. Just get rid of all of that. Just focus on the Weapon X story itself is such a solid story. And I feel like with both these first two Wolverine movies, you had the studio interference, especially in the third act. That's where it feels the strongest, because that's when they're like, this is a superhero movie. We have to have a big superhero fight. And the same thing happened in the Wolverine. The Wolverine is a great movie throughout the first two acts. And then when it gets to the third act, it's, let's just throw in a giant robot here because they're in Japan. And
Right.
it completely breaks the flow of that entire movie. And this movie too has that same problem. And I feel like if you would just, and finally, luckily we finally got to Logan, and they're just like, just do what you want. We're done with this character anyway. So, and finally they were able to, and he, James Mangold showed them you can do a very successful Wolverine movie without going the full superhero movie route. And I really think this is where the character of Wolverine excels, is when you're taking him out of the X-Men environment, don't do it as a superhero movie. Do it as, a modern day Western. That's what makes the best Wolverine stories.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it goes back to the whole, like, what's great about Marvel superheroes versus DC, which, they're two different flavors, and there's nothing that says one is better than the other. It's just a personal preference thing. But my personal preference is for my heroes to have flaws, so I gravitate towards Marvel, um, as opposed to wish fulfillment in DC, which is a generalization, but but the the thing about those stories that makes them work, like a Spider-Man movie allows Peter Parker to have real world problems because that's the heart of who Spider-Man is. And it's the same thing with Wolverine.
Yeah, exactly. And I want to talk a little bit about Silver Fox. I will say one of the cool things here is they did give Logan his iconic line, "I'm the best there is at what I do, and what I do isn't very nice." So I did like
Yes.
that they worked that in there.
Yes.
Um, but I don't know what they were doing with Silver Fox here. Like, the whole, like, first off, you're gonna whitewash her to begin with, and then you're gonna have her telling this Native American story to Wolverine, and which is how he gets the name. And then to top it all off, you're going to make her a mutant, and you're going to make her Emma Frost's older sister. Like, none of this makes any sense.
Nope. It almost feels like they had two characters and they mashed them into one, or like like somebody said it's a good idea if we condense characters because you do that in especially in visual arts because you only have so many people.
Mm-hmm.
But with a complete disregard for any of the source material it becomes a problem.
Well, also too, when he finds her body, like they make this whole point of saying like, oh well, they gave her this drug that slowed down her heartbeat. I'm like, motherfucker, Wolverine's got a sense of smell. Like, can't he tell that he's got touch and all this kind of stuff? Can't he tell that this woman has not actually been mauled to death? I mean, it's one thing if you have it be like the car Sabretooth blows up the car or something. That would make more sense. I would
Yes.
buy that. But
Yes.
this is just with the character you have, it doesn't make a goddamn lick of sense why he would be tricked with this. Even have a flashback or something where you find out that when he saw her body, she touched him to make him see her as dead or something like that.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. And the thing that gets me is that um, the injury that they faked involves spilling a bunch of blood.
Yeah.
So you're telling us that he didn't like. First of all, it has to be human blood because otherwise it's going to smell different to him. And it has to be fresh, and like a lot of stuff has to all fall into place for this to even have a chance of working.
Yeah.
It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Yeah, none of that works. And just the whole idea of Emma Frost in there and throwing Scott in there too. It's just like this is just becoming gratuitous now. Now you're just trying to find ways to use as many of these IPs as you possibly can.
Well, and why don't they just make them like? Why do they have to be sisters? Why can't they be? I mean, even if you say they're best friends or something, like
Mm-hmm.
I'm much happier buying that than their sisters. Or
Yeah.
how about just they captured all my friends?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and then I also want to talk a little bit about Taylor Kish as Gambit in this. So this was, I mean, aside from the Deadpool thing, I think this was probably the thing that got the most complaints from fans. Um, so I'm not sure. Like, I know you're an X-Men fan. How big of a Gambit fan are you?
I have all kinds of Gambit shirts. I didn't wear one today. Yes, it's a problem. It's a
So, I
problem.
mean, I'm gonna I'm gonna defend Taylor Kish to some extent in this.
Okay.
I mean, first off, the guy was given shit to work with to begin with. I mean, let's be honest. You can only polish a turd so many different ways. Um, and like so a lot of it comes down to just like what he was given. Like the whole idea of his staff being like this diamond tipped walking stick was weird. The whole idea of him always like using it to like super jump in the air and crash down was weird. And so it's just like those, and also like the coat they give him is way too short if we're talking about like Gambit's appearance wise. So all of that stuff, that's stuff that Taylor Kish had no one couldn't help. On the accent front, yeah, it could have been a little bit more. But on the other hand, you know, I'm also doing an episode on Deadpool and Wolverine, so I got to see the other side of it here with Channing Tatum playing him. And I don't know about you, but as much as I thought that was a fun cameo, it also showed me why I'm glad that we never saw Channing Tatum do a full-on Gambit movie, because I think he would have been too hard to take seriously. In Deadpool and Wolverine, I thought it was fine, but I think maybe he was also overdoing it because he was in a Deadpool movie. But I think like that kind of style is way too over the top. There's a middle ground in the accent, because if you take it too far, it can probably work in live action, it can work in the comics, but it can work in the animated series and work in the comics. But I think if you do that in live action, you have like that very thick accent. I don't think the audiences are going to take it very seriously.
I agree accent wise. I do think, and we're not going to talk about this movie. I know you're going to do it in another thing, but I would really love to see a multiverse movie with Gambit, with Channing Tatum, and have the unintelligible Gambit be only one of them and have him talk to himself. I would pay a lot of money to see that. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right about the accent in that I think it does need to be a little bit lighter. Although cartoon Gambit had a stronger accent and was still very understandable.
Mm-hmm.
So like heading more towards cartoon Gambit, I think would have been great. Um, I agree with you that he doesn't look right. And for me, like, you know, once you get past the early X-Men movies in which no one is wearing their correct costumes, it becomes less of a thing. If you can accept the fact that they're not wearing, you know, Wolverine doesn't wear the yellow until the most recent one. If you can accept that, then I can accept that his coat is a little off. For me, the thing about this Gambit is that because of the way that they wrote the plot, you don't really get to see. Big part of Gambit is his charm,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And he's not in a position. What's he going to do? Charm Wolverine? Although he does he pokes fun at Wolverine. He gives him a hard time, but they don't have that relationship yet. So, what does he have to do from a personality? Like, he plays with cards and he gets in an argument with Wolverine and then it goes away. So, it doesn't feel like you ever really get to see him be Gambit at all.
No, I agree, and I think like when so many people complain about his role, like I really think this script just did not serve him well. He didn't get enough screen time because he's a good actor. I mean, I love John Carter. I thought he was great in John Carter. I've only seen like one episode of the Waco TV show he did, but he was amazing in that. And
Yeah.
so I'm like, he's got the chops to really have done a good thing here, but it's just like you've got him there in a casino to begin with. So when Wolverine finds him, show him like charming someone or something like that. Something like that. Yeah, you know, it's you want to show the character in their element, and when you don't do that, you're like one of the things, you know, that bugged me about both cuts of Justice League, the Snyder cut and the Whedon cut, was that you've got this character Aquaman whose whole thing is being able to command sea life, and you're going to set the final battle somewhere where it's completely landlocked and you can't use his signature ability. Like you should be able to showcase all those characters doing what they're good at, and you take that away from Aquaman. I feel like there's something similar here with Gambit where you're not giving him the chance to really show the things he's really good at. Like he uses the cards once with Wolverine and that's it. After that he just keeps doing the staff jump. And it was just and like I did think like the his best scene was when him and Logan are in the plane and he's giving Logan shit. That was the best part. That was his best scene in the movie. And unfortunately, it's too short of a time frame that we get there.
Yeah. Well, and I think it goes back to your point about them trying to cram in all of those other mutants. If you had taken out um, Sister Emma and Scott and all those other mutants and stuck with just Gambit as the key cameo for the last act, so you could have really done something with him instead of sending him away. Like it's a little bit weird that he drops Logan off, he leaves, and then he just kind of pops back up at the end very conveniently. Um, why didn't he just land in the first place if he was going to stay?
Right. Yeah. And also, if you're gonna have this situation with Gambit being the key, and this is the big cameo everybody wants in this movie. This and Deadpool were probably the two cameos everybody really wanted to see. Nobody wanted Emma Frost in this movie. Nobody wanted Cyclops in this movie. As cool as it was to see Patrick Stewart back, nobody was going to this expecting to see Patrick Stewart. Like the two characters that people wanted to see outside of Wolverine were Deadpool and Gambit, and the movie doesn't really serve either one with the kind of attention they need. Like if Gambit's going to be this linchpin to the plan, one way to show him off and to have is to have have him and Logan have a few encounters like where he's getting away from Logan. That would get to show him being, more cunning, more smooth, um, more of his thief type skills. All of that would work a lot better in that way. So, and then you could have Logan you could understand Logan's frustration, why he's getting angry all the time at this guy too, would make a lot more sense. Instead, he just goes to the casino, he goes out the door, he fights Sabretooth, and then he punches Gambit, and the next thing we know, they're best friends. Like, come on.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. And I think a chase, especially if you go back to that idea that you had where he's trying to he's trying to remember things, then a chase scene in that context becomes really, really interesting because what does Gambit know? And how can he help? And Wolverine doesn't remember.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Also too, the whole bonding process. I thought the bonding process was very effective. I thought they did a good job showing just like how traumatic this kind of operation is, because when you see it, I mean, granted it was a kids cartoon show, there's not a whole lot they can show, but when you see it in there, it's just like these bands that glow and then they melt into his skin. It doesn't, you don't really understand, you don't get the full sense of how horrifying it is. But the movie does a really good job of showcasing just what an invasive, brutal procedure is, especially the fact that he can't do it under anesthesia. So I thought that was a good touch when and they also say like why isn't he sedated? It's like, well, anesthesia doesn't work on him. He heals it, right out of his system.
Yeah.
All of that was really cool. Although I did think it was weird that right before he goes in the bonding process, Stryker shows him, "Oh, I forgot your dog tags," and then he's like, "I want new ones." Like, okay, well, let's stop the procedure so we can make new dog tags. Then.
Yeah. They just happened to have a tag stamp right there.
Mm-hmm.
They were ready. But I agree with you. And like, I think Hugh Jackman does a really good job in this scene because you see his body language immediately change, from when he goes into the water to when he comes out. And then you get the naked running, which, I can deal with that.
Yeah. Um, I remember. I'm not sure if you ever heard his story about when he was filming. I think it was X2,
Yes.
and he was talking about how they were filming the Weapon X scene when he escapes from the facility, and he's running out naked, and then it's like all the crew is waiting there, including like James Marsden's mom, and they're all like waving dollar
Waving
bills at him.
money. And apparently, he like the first thing you do is you cover the bits, but he has blades attached to his hands. I mean, I'm sure they're not sharp, but they were sharp enough, and he was just
It's
like,
sharp enough, yeah,
"Oh,
yeah. Well, also the first movie too, like his first day of filming, they're doing the scene at the Statue of Liberty, and he's in this harness and he gets dropped and he's like being hung, and this harness is right around his balls, and he's like being hung there for like a few minutes before they can get him down. And Bryan Singer's like running around the monitors, like, "Tell me we got it, tell me we got it," because he knew he wasn't gonna film it again.
mm-hmm." Yeah, I don't.
Oh
I
yeah,
mean, all that wire work is really, really fun to watch, but I'm not sure I would care to do it.
yeah, no. Also, like this, I visually, I've got a few problems with this movie. Just the CGI in this is terrible. Like, I mean, my God, this is 2009, and the CGI feels. I feel like we saw better CGI in the earlier X-Men movies.
Yeah, I mean, I think the nails growing on Sabretooth looks good.
Yeah,
Wolverine's adamantium claws look fine. The bone claws are weird. The pacing when they come out is weird. Um, they look kind of flimsy,
hmm
which they're not supposed to be as strong as the adamantium ones, and I get that, but that was weird. Emma's diamond form is looks like a cartoon.
yeah. I mean, both this and First Class, I thought the diamond forms in both of them just did not look good.
Yeah.
First Class was better, but it was still not that great. But this was just terrible. But Wolverine's claws, like the CGI, in them, especially when he's in the bathroom and he's examining them, it looks so fake. Um, and even when
Yeah,
like
yeah, you're
Sabretooth,
right.
when he goes to the car and he's dragging his claws up across Silver Fox's car, like you see like it you're just watching. I'm just watching. I'm just like, I had to double check that I was watching like the official cut and not like the bootlegged early release cut, because it just looks so fake.
Yeah, I think they put more attention to the actual Like when the claws come out, they look good because they're probably CGI and not practical effects.
Hmm.
But I wonder if they used practical effects for things like the dragging of the claws or when he's just holding them, and that's why they look so flimsy.
No, I think those were actually those were CGI. It definitely looked like
Really?
CGI to me. Yeah. Yeah. Because I think practically you could have done that a lot better. And I just feel like they were way too reliant on CGI in this movie. Fortunately, it seems like they learned their lesson because I don't remember any sort of really bad CGI on the claws or that kind of stuff in the Wolverine. So I think they learned their lesson from this, like not to over rely on CGI. Because also in the in the first three films too, right? Those were all props for the most part. Like he
Right.
wasn't using CGI for the claws, except for when they like come out or something like that. But otherwise, they were using props for all of that stuff. And I guess here they thought it'd be cheaper, and it's like this. I mean, I don't mind CGI. Like I know some people are just like, oh, all practical stuff is good. I'm not gonna, come on and say anything like that because I think CGI definitely has a place. And I think, but when you're gonna use it, you have to plan it very carefully and you have to have a reason to do it. Like I think James Gunn does an amazing job with this. That's why in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, even when you have these completely CGI characters like Rocket and Lila, there's so much care put into. He made sure that he had that scene planned out from every angle and he knew how it was going to work so that he knew exactly what to tell the animators. It wasn't like with Love and Thunder where they're like, oh, we'll just fix it in post.
Yeah. Well, and
uh
there's a character and a core to the story as opposed to let's just get two CGI characters together and make them beat the crap out of each other.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think that's pretty much everything I had. Oh, the other thing too is just like Logan's hairstyle too. I mean, I it's like it's hard to even comment on it being a hairstyle because it's almost like non-existent here. It's just like this kind of like floppy thing he's got on his head.
Yeah, it's a vaguely mullety. It doesn't have like I feel like they finally hit their stride with Deadpool and Wolverine, where they got the I don't know what you want to call them, the spikes. The
Mm.
shape of it is correct, which
The
there's no
wolf ears
shape
is
to
how
it.
I've always called it.
Yeah, yeah. There's no shape to it here. It looks a little bit like a 80s rock star.
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think my basic summation of this is just like it's just so disappointing because this was Hugh Jackman's and this was like this was like within this midst of like a bunch of like bad movies Hugh Jackman had been in. Like there was Van Helsing, and I think even probably he was starting to doubt whether or not he had success as a leading man at this point because it was. I mean, Hugh Jackman was probably the best thing of the first three X-Men movies, and to just see this opportunity to do such an iconic story and just have it kind of wasted was really. I mean, because you go back to that Barry Windsor Smith Weapon X series, and it's amazing. And it feels like we got less. I'm gonna pull some comic book references here, but it feels like we were less Weapon X and we were more like the Wolverine Origin series, which I did not like at all.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that it feels like a missed opportunity. And regardless of whether or not it's comic accurate, because I do understand, especially once you've written in multiple formats, you understand that they are different, and some stories that work well in one format won't work in another one because of the differences between them. It's not because the story's not good. It's just because of the pacing and how the story's told and that kind of thing. The sorts of stories that I tell in my Marvel novels wouldn't necessarily work in comics. That's why you tell it in a novel. And
No, yeah,
so
no,
I
I
can,
yeah, yeah, I understand all that, and I'm totally fine with. I'm not one of these people who I'm not a purist about the adaptation side of things.
right.
I actually I enjoy most of the X-Men movies for what they are, even flaws and all. And even despite the fact that there's all these departures from the source material. That kind of stuff I'm fine with. I mean,
Yeah.
but I feel like too it's weird though when you look at something like the original Weapon X, because they almost made this more comic booky than the original Weapon X story was.
Yeah.
That's what feels weird about it.
Yeah, it does. Well, and just, the story doesn't quite hold together. Um, it doesn't hold together if you don't know the comics, and it doesn't hold together if you do. So
Yeah,
who is it
yeah.
for?
I think that's a good question to ask. Like, who is this movie really for? Because, people who are new to this character are probably just going to be confused by all the stuff that's going on in here. People who are fans of the X-Men movies, they're going to be confused because this stuff doesn't line up. People who are fans of this character are just going to be angry that you screwed up so much stuff like Deadpool and Gambit. So it that question, who is this really for? I mean, honestly, I think at the end of the day, it was just for the producers.
I think you're probably right. Yeah. And
But I think sorry, go ahead.
oh no, I mean, I was just going to kind of say, from the point of view of somebody who's written some of this stuff, figuring out who it's for is one of the most important things you can do.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think that's a pretty good note to end on. There any final things you wanted to say about this film?
Um, I hate. I guess the one thing that I want to say is that I kind of hate to crap on people's creative output, because I understand that every piece of creative output is, it's something you try to make the best that you can. And I do think that there are some bright points here, and I'm glad that they got the opportunity to do more of them and to do it right. This one's just a bit of a bummer.
No, and I agree with that. And I think we've done a pretty good job of trying to approach this movie in an even-handed manner. I mean, because there are good things, like we said, Liev Schreiber. I never know how to pronounce his name
Me either.
correctly, so I apologize if I get it wrong. But I mean, he does a great job. I think Jackman does as good a job as he could be expected to with this material and this kind of like schizophrenic character arc he's on here. Same thing with I mean, with the exception of I'm sorry to say Will.I.am, I think most of these actors do a pretty serviceable job given what they're given in in spite of what they're given to work with in some cases. But it's just the script was a mess, and there's just and like you said, it just they don't really know what they're trying to do here. They don't really know who this movie is for, and so it just ends up becoming this big mishmash of weird cameos that I mean, no one aside from like the most hardcore Marvel fan is gonna understand who Bolt is. I mean,
Yeah.
so it's just like the it's just very very odd, and I think that's and fortunately like they did slowly learn their lesson over these movies, and now that we're done with the Fox stuff, now that we do have Marvel with these rights, hopefully we can get a much more accurate or even not necessarily accurate in terms of the comic, but it's just a better version of this origin story, because the Weapon X story is a good story and it is an interesting story, and it's one that I think deserves a decent adaptation.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think just seeing the X-Men as a part of the MCU and seeing how they managed to integrate them is like I am psyched.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. But that's a good note to end on. So, Carrie, why don't you tell people where they can find your stuff?
Well, you can find me online at carrieharrisbooks.com. I was on the Twitter space, but now that it is no longer the Twitter space, I am on Blue Sky, which is actually how I ended up on here. But you can find me on Blue Sky at Carrhar, Carrhar. And I'm also around the interwebs. I do quite a few podcasts and that sort of thing. And um, I'm always happy to geek out with fellow nerds.
Awesome. Well, you're welcome to come back anytime you like. So we'll definitely have you back on again at some point. We'll have links to that stuff in the show notes, audience. So please make sure to check out those links. And as for us, as Carrie mentioned, we're also on Blue Sky, Super Cinema Pod, also technically on Instagram and Threads, although I basically just post updates there, and it's Super Cinema Pod on both of those. The website is superherocinephiles.com, so please make sure to check that out. And you can also find out about being a guest yourself if that tickles your fancy. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks for listening to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. Superhero Cinephiles is produced by me, Percival Constantine. The show is created by myself and the late, great Derek Ferguson, our host emeritus. Visit us on the web at superherocinephiles.com to listen to past episodes or find out how you can be a guest yourself. Support the show by visiting our advertiser links or click the Buy Me a Coffee link on the website to make a one-time donation. We are Super Cinema Pod on both Instagram and Blue Sky, so please be sure to follow us. We'd also appreciate it if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.